Hello, I'm Natalie, and today we are going to learn about menstruation. What is it? Who does it? Why do we do it? So contrary to popular belief, dogs do not menstruate. That blood emerges from their vagina, not their uterus. So first clue, menstruation is blood whose origin is the uterus. And also, contrary to what some vegans believe, chickens, an egg that comes from a chicken is not a chicken menstruation. Chickens do not menstruate. Menstruation specifically refers to the shedding of a decidualized uterine lining. So the uterus is the female reproductive organ that houses the growing embryo or fetus. Decidualization is a fancy word that refers to all of these different processes that happen to the uterine lining that prepare it for pregnancy. So in species that menstruate, which include humans, some great apes such as chimpanzees, bonobos, gorillas, a few bats, and under special circumstances, the elephant shrew. So all of these animals undergo this process called decidualization. And what happens is after the uterus grows a little bit of a lining, and we call that the proliferation of the lining. And that happens mostly under the hormonal control of estrogen. So as a woman's body, we'll talk about women specifically here, as the woman's eggs, as one of them grows larger and gets ready to ovulate, it produces and secretes more and more estrogen. And that estrogen targets the uterus, which makes the lining of the uterus grow thicker. And then after ovulation happens, there's cells that were surrounding the egg that remain, and that's called the corpus luteum. And the corpus luteum secretes progesterone, and progesterone is the key hormone that initiates this process of decidualization. And as the endometrial lining becomes decidualized, a bunch of changes happen to the actual cells. So the cells become larger, they form little gaps between themselves, and the cells take on these secretory properties. So they can secrete chemicals and molecules that have different kinds of immunological properties and even different kinds of scents that can attract the embryo. So that inner part of the uterus, right? The uterus is an organ with a space in the middle. It's mostly composed of muscle, but the inside is a space, and the most internal surface layer is the endometrium or uterine lining. So we'll use those words interchangeably. And that's where that progesterone-driven decidualization is occurring. So basically, under the influence of progesterone, a woman or female's uterus is getting ready for implantation because those transformed cells create this important layer of tissue for the embryo to contact and then burrow into. So this still doesn't really answer the question of why some species menstruate and some don't, because obviously lots of species grow babies and have a uterus, and even many other species, say such as dogs or rabbits, they do have cells that decidualize, but the process is initiated by a different factor. So in women, it happens hormonally every month in a cyclical way. In other animals, such as dogs and rabbits, and many other ones, all the ones that don't menstruate, it happens in response to an embryo. So once the sperm and egg have fused and the embryo finds its way into the uterus, and once the embryo contacts the uterus, then the cells where the embryo has contacted will start to undergo those transformations that we talked about. But in all these other species, there are the few species that menstruate, it happens under a hormonal cyclical process. So why is that the case? To understand that, we have to think about something called genetic conflict. And genetic conflict occurs whenever you have two individuals interacting that have different genes. So in the mother's body, she has her own genome, And the embryo shares some of her genes and some of the father's genes. And the embryo's genome creates the placenta. And the placenta is this fascinating, important organ that embeds into, it attaches to, in some species, and deeply embeds in other species into the uterine lining. And so the placenta and the fetus have different genes that are foreign to the mother's body. And the fetus placenta as a unit are going to have different evolutionary interests and overlapping interests with the mother. So the mother and the baby want, I put that in quotations because it's not a conscious want, it's like a biological or evolutionary drive. The mother wants to have a healthy pregnancy and have an offspring. And she also wants to conserve some of her nutrients and metabolic energy, time for other activities and other future offspring. The embryo would like to survive at any cost, because if they don't survive, that's the end of their life and genome. So this creates a little bit of tension or conflict between the mother and the developing embryo and its fetus, because the fetus and embryo are going to be under selection to extract more resources and nutrition and energy than the mother would prefer to give. And one way that the fetal placental unit extracts energy from the mother is through this embedding into her uterus. So in humans, the placenta is so invasive that it actually grows arteries that penetrate into the muscular layer of the uterus. And this allows the fetus to exert some control over the mother's metabolism. And that gives the fetus access to more glucose and more blood. And this can put a lot of pressure on the mother's body. So in evolutionary biology, we understand the decidualization process as a protective response evolved by the mother to restrain some of that embryo's invasiveness. So in preparation, before the embryo is even there, the mother's body builds up some layers and then transforms and develops these immune molecules and other properties that help her body prevent the placenta from invading too deeply, and also preparing her body for the incoming overlapping but also diverging genetic being, that little embryo placenta unit. So menstruation is the shedding of that lining. So if implantation doesn't occur, that once the progesterone levels drop in the mother's body, all of those transformed cells leave the body through the blood flow out the vagina that we call menstruation or bleeding. And another interesting part of this is with pregnancy being so challenging and energetically expensive, especially in humans, we can also understand menstruation as being a fairly simple mechanism for the mother's body to release a pregnancy that might not be viable. And this is a good example of where the embryo and the mother might have a different interest, because that embryo is going to want to survive and stick it through the pregnancy and be born at any cost. But the mother's body is going to be under selection to be able to sense or judge, is this embryo going to transform into a healthy baby, or will it maybe not be able to survive? Because energetically, it'd be very expensive to continue with a pregnancy where the baby may not make it into their own adult life. So menstruation can also be a way of releasing a pregnancy that the mother's body has sensed as not being viable or high enough quality. So another interesting part about this decidualization menstruation pair, we have to think about them as a pair, because that evolution of the mother's protective response, her being able to grow and transform this lining that interacts with the embryo, that restrains the placenta a little bit, that creates a whole new possibility for diseases and issues in pregnancy. And that's where evolutionary medicine comes from as a discipline. In evolutionary medicine, we try to understand human health and disease, and other animals too, but I mostly study humans. We try to understand what are these broader evolutionary historical reasons for why humans get certain kinds of diseases. So there's a couple diseases related to pregnancy that are directly linked to this decidualization, menstruation adaptations. So one example would be placental accreta, and that is when the placenta doesn't actually detach after birth. So, and that can be because the placenta has invaded so deeply that it has a hard time letting go from the mother's body, and that can create some pretty serious health outcomes. Another example is preeclampsia. So preeclampsia is when a woman develops very high blood pressure in her pregnancy, and it can result in death of both the mother and baby if it's not monitored or treated. And people estimate it happens in as many as 10% of human pregnancies. So it's a pretty serious thing. And what we've learned is that if the placenta doesn't invade deeply enough, preeclampsia is more likely to occur. So it seems to be, if the fetus isn't able to have its placenta invade deeply enough, it responds by releasing factors that increase the mother's blood pressure. So the fetus is trying to get the nutrition it needs, which didn't occur through the invasive placenta. So yeah, that is my kind of brief overview of what menstruation is, how it's an outcome of decidualization, how it can help women's bodies release pregnancies that don't work, and how it can also, unfortunately, lead to some health problems in our species. So I hope you enjoyed learning something maybe new today.